Let me introduce our panelists for the evening. Anna, of course, you know, on my right, and we've just listened to her. Brendon Pooran, next to her, is the founder and principal lawyer at Pooran Law, which concentrates on disability issues. He has been involved with various disability organizations for most of his career. He teaches critical disability law at York University. Brendon holds a Bachelor of Commerce degree from Queen's University and a law degree from Osgoode Hall Law School. Jessica Rotolo is a multi-talented performer in several arts, including dance and singing and acting on stage and in film. She's appeared in several musical productions, and this year she won the Motion Ball Idol competition for Toronto. She's also devoted a lot of her time and talent in helping community living and the Canadian Down Syndrome Society to get their message across to the public in several commercials, public service announcements, which I'm sure you've seen on television. And lastly, at the end of the table, Mr. Sam Forbes. He's probably known to many of you as the Dancing Barista. This was a YouTube video of him dancing and serving customers at a Toronto Starbucks, and the thing went viral in an amazing way. Sam has been diagnosed with autism and intellectual disability, which he is happy to talk about because it's his way of breaking through the stereotypes which people may have about intellectual disabilities. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel for this evening. I want to start, if I can, with Jessica, because you had a special reason for wanting to be on the panel tonight.
Yeah.
I understand. Well, what exactly?
Well, I wanted to be on this panel because me and my family helped a friend who had special needs change his life. And I hope you and the rest of the audience can do the same thing for someone else.
And that's why you're here tonight?
Yes.
Sam, what about you? You wanted to come? For what reason?
I wanted to be a part of this panel because I believe in equality and the equal treatment of people with intellectual disabilities, and I want everyone to thrive.
You didn't mention, but you've been on Ellen's show, is that right? Ellen DeGeneres?
Yes.
How did that go? What were you doing there?
So it was like a really thrilling and like out of this world kind of experience. Ellen saw the viral video that me and Chris were involved in, and she had her producers give us some Skype calls. And in the last Skype call, she said, "Do you want to be on the Ellen DeGeneres show?" And I said yes, and I did a little bit of like a dance because I was so happy, and I felt like this was a dream. I didn't really feel like this was happening. And Ellen, to me anyway, is one of the most genuine, kind persons in Hollywood. And I really, really applaud her for taking the time to hear my story and hear the experiences I've gone through and hear the challenges and difficulties that I've gone through. And I think she's just such a really good, kind, genuine person.
And you're both going on, Jessica including you, you're going on to Humber, is that right? Humber?
Yes.
The two of you. And I want to ask, a number of questions occurred to me while you were talking, but the first one that jumped out, I want to get a sense of how governments respond to the work you're doing. What is their reaction when you show up knocking on the door?
I think it depends. We don't knock on a door without a local country partner, so wherever we are working with organizations and families and people with intellectual disabilities. And some governments are really keen. They are reaching out and asking for help and assistance. When we talk about the negotiations of the convention, I sometimes feel like we sort of created this bubble of people who are really involved and really on board, and then the conventions go home, right? They go back to their capital city, and there was a bit of a collective, we said, what? So a lot of people are really honestly struggling with what does this mean and how do we do this? And we know these are complicated questions. So what we try and do is extend ourselves as partners and say, we get it, it's hard, we're here to help you figure that out. So often governments can be really receptive to that, and I do think people want to get it right. There's just a lot of things that get in the way and make them get it wrong.
Do you have some kind of system or systems for monitoring how various nation states, how various governments carry out the details of the convention?
Sure. So there's all conventions are monitored by treaty bodies. So we have a committee on the rights of persons with disabilities, and countries who have ratified the convention are required to report to that. So through our team and through our partners, so Inclusion International, we have about 200 members in about 115 countries around the world. So here in Canada, the Canadian Association for Community Living and People First Canada are members of ours. So we work with those groups to help them get involved in that reporting process and then to report back to us what is happening. And a lot of the time we'll see coalition reports that go in, so a cross-disability coalition. And as we know, often cross-disability coalitions marginalize people with intellectual disabilities, and a lot of them simply won't let families in the room. So how do we sort of engage that? And through those experiences, we monitor the process quite closely.
Brendon, in terms of the law and the regulatory side of government, do children with disabilities have exactly the same rights as the non-disabled?
Thanks for starting off with an easy question.
Just a real low ball.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, theoretically, the answer is yes. I mean, as Anna spoke to in her discussion, she identified the fact that we have a very strong, a very robust legal system here in Canada with very strong legislative frameworks that protect the rights of people with disabilities and with children with disabilities. I mean, we're still one of the only countries in the world that have legal protections entrenched in our Constitution for people with mental and physical disabilities. The reality is, though, unfortunately, we don't necessarily walk the talk. There have been some significant developments, I think, in Canadian law and policy over the past 20 or 30 years. We've closed institutions here in Ontario. We've ratified the convention. We've introduced accessibility legislation provincially here, and we're doing the same thing at the federal level. In the near future, we have introduced a registered disability savings plan to promote future financial security, but children with intellectual disabilities are still facing a significant amount of exclusion in various aspects of life.
Anna was talking about barriers, which maybe I'll get some examples of that, but are the barriers coming down fast enough, do you think, or are the right ones? Is there a priority of what needs to be done for disabled kids?
I mean, I think there are some very strong systemic barriers that are very difficult to overcome. And in order for those to be torn down, we need very, very, very strong leadership. And I don't know that we've necessarily seen that politically. There are attitudinal barriers that I think are a little bit, or can be more easily addressed. I think Anna spoke to the importance of parents and of family, and I think it starts there. I think really identifying yourself as a family member, as a champion of your son, your daughter, your sibling with a disability is so important, because that will resonate with your other family members, with your peers, with your friends. And
I want to ask Jessica, the importance of rights. You have rights.
Yep.
And how important are they to you? What do you
Well, they're really important to me because, well, my rights are like, so my rights are like,
Take your time.
I should have the exact same rights you have, except there's a small little difference. I need like support of a family and friends to help me get those rights. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sam, you want to say something? Yeah. It's you, and you mentioned something that resonated with me is when children with disabilities are defined solely by their disability. When people talk about my daughter, oh yeah, she's disabled, without looking at other elements, other things. Is that one of the major obstacles that you find in terms of coming to grips with the essential quality of those kids?
Yeah, I think there is. It's sort of the attitudinal piece that Brendon was talking about, but there really is an us and them, and this ongoing devaluation that somehow a child with a disability, their life is less than or different because it's not as good as. And I think that becomes a significant challenge for how we tackle things and how we look at inclusion more broadly.
But how do you incorporate that in language, in an international treaty, an international convention? How do you give that body, how do you give it form?
I mean, the technical legal language around all that stuff is on an equal basis with others. And so we talk a lot, and particularly at the international level, where we are working in countries that don't have the legal structures that we have. And for all the challenges that we know persist in places like Toronto or Halifax, where I live, we still are light years ahead of where a lot of other countries are. And I think that this notion of on an equal basis with others really helps us explain that really this is about making sure that kids with disabilities have the right to the same, sometimes crappy life as other people, right? The school's not great for everyone sometimes. So I think it's about using that language of equality to just say that this is about having the same life as anyone else. As Jesse was saying, it's about having the same rights as anybody else.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned schools, because it was last week in Toronto, there was a report issued that showed that parents with children with intellectual disabilities, that their kids are not getting the educational services that they're entitled to by law, Brendon. It's written down. They're entitled to these services and are not getting them.
I think the stat was over 50%, about 54% of parents reported that their children aren't receiving the accommodations that they require in our school system. I think there was a quarter, 25%, that spoke about schools asking parents to pick up their child without any kind of justifiable explanation. And there are hundreds of kids that have shortened school days, 4 or 5 hours a day.
Really?
Yeah.
Is this because they're considered a destabilizing influence or a distraction for the other kids, or what? What is the thinking behind that?
Well, I think there are a number of issues. I think the way that I think the provisions in our Education Act are outdated. I think our identification and placement process is outdated. So we tend to start with identifying where a student should be placed, followed by what do they need to not only survive but thrive. And when you think about it, that's backwards when we think about human rights legislation or human rights frameworks generally. I mean, we should be starting with a presumption of inclusion, a presumption that every child has the right to learn with others, and then ask ourselves, okay, well, what will it take for that
To
child
do it, yeah.
to thrive?
Is this a common obstacle, Anna, in your work internationally, that the fact that we don't keep up fast enough with our understanding, it lags behind our ability to provide services?
I'm not sure. I mean, inclusive education, hands down, is probably the #1 issue that comes up. And we still have, like in a lot of countries, children with intellectual disabilities are not allowed to go to school. Full stop. There is nothing. There is zero provision. There is zero requirement on that government to provide inclusive education. The convention has changed that. There is now an international standard that requires countries to get on board with that. But I think that when we look at what's going on around the world, we're dealing with very different barriers at different times. And sometimes we're dealing with our greatest export is often a service model to disability. So if you're in a developing country, I joke a little bit about, remember dial-up, the internet, when you used to like, dee, 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 and a lot of places just totally jumped right on over dial-up and went straight to like the 4G network. And I think that there is something that we need to figure out of how do we help other countries skip over that whole period of dial-up in supports and services that we went to, that we now in our country spend a lot of our time trying to rip down those barriers we created through a service structure. So sometimes I think we've got to make sure, that what's that tail wagging the dog, and like we've got to make sure we're not just throwing money at services that may or may not actually be the answer to how we support people. And this, for me, is where we've got to get into that mainstream movement, particularly on education.
Well, you emphasized, I think, the importance of partnership. Well, you talked about two things: family, crucial, but partnerships as well. How do they work and how do they fail?
Partnerships?
Yeah.
They work really well when people feel valued and included. They work terribly when people don't feel valued and included, or you feel ignored, or you feel, and I'm sure everyone knows this one, you feel like you're a token. You're at the table simply to check a box somewhere. We have to have meaningful partnerships, and we need to be able to onboard partnerships. I think our own communities often have been very, throughout our history and around the world, our history is very similar. It is largely a middle to upper income group of families who are able to come together and make this fight. We have not done a great job at taking on issues of poverty in our own communities. We have not done a great job at addressing issues for racialized youth, and we need to be looking at how are we being respectful in our partnerships.
Because they're all interconnected.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Brendon, I think North Americans have an idea that for every problem there must be a legal solution. Does the current regimen of laws that we have, is it sufficient, do you think? In terms of not just providing services, but dealing with the things that Anna's talking about, inclusion and...
Well, I think as I mentioned, we've got these legal protections entrenched in our charter, in our constitution.
That's a start.
And that's a start. And our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is the supreme law of the land. And so what that means is that every other piece of legislation, whether it be federal, provincial, or municipal, must comply with the charter. And we have very strong equality provisions within the charter. And so arguably, we have a legal framework. We have a means to challenge or to contest any law or any policy that's been designed, developed, and implemented by government, to contest whether or not it does actually provide for these an inclusive life for children with intellectual disabilities.
But it's not going to work if the families are not engaged, is it?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, with respect to sort of a legal challenge in particular, or I think it's very difficult for families. I think families want to be engaged, and I think families are engaged, but I think taking it to the next level and actually launching a constitutional challenge is a whole other story when it comes to time, resources, and the financial costs involved with doing so. And that's where Anna spoke to the importance of partnerships with community organizations and the importance of ensuring that we have intervener status at legal cases that affect our community.
If you could, and perhaps both of you, Anna and Brendon, are there one or two things that you would like to see changed immediately that could facilitate the kinds of objects that you're looking at, the kinds of targets you're trying to hit? Is there something that jumps out at you that we could do this now and it would help?
Jump in on that, or?
Waiting for you, Anna.
Yeah. Notice you're taking a drink of water. And you know what? I don't think there's an easy, quick, big win. There's lots of quick little wins, and there are big wins. Like I think it's important that we do reflect on what Brendon's saying about we've got a really strong legal framework. So for me, those quick little wins really do start small, and they start in our communities. They start by people feeling valued and welcomed and feel like they belong. And I think for me, the piece around supporting families, of course, is supporting families, but it's also setting families up from a really young age to have expectations so that they know you can fight this at school. They know that you should be able to walk into that classroom and expect that your kiddo's included like anybody else in that classroom. And that's where I think families need a lot of support. And a colleague of ours, some of you might be familiar with her from Inclusion Alberta, Robin Acton, said something to me one time about her daughter was still quite young, and someone said something along the lines of, well, where do you think she'll go to university? Or something about university. And she said it was this like earth-opening moment for her when she thought, we can do that too. So I think it's about setting up families to see a vision and a future of inclusion and helping families manage the things that we're terrified about. What is going to happen when we're old? What is going to happen when we're gone? I think that's the piece around families that will make significant change.
But it's interesting because in the work I've done over the years, families are tired.
Yeah.
They are exhausted, and they don't tend to carry picket signs or demonstrate. And I don't know if they form enough of a constituency to make an impression on the political will of the day. Brendon, what do you think?
Well, I can speak to families here in Ontario, and there are some very, very strong family networks here that bind together, that rely on each other, that learn from each other. I think, it's important to ensure that families and community organizations alike have a common set of values and principles, right? Because what we don't want, and again, Anna spoke to this, is we don't want a divided community. We don't want a divided voice, because then it is very easy for government to ignore us. And so I think education and outreach, I think facilitating conferences and seminars like this one that really focus on strong values and strong principles is so important.
Except Anna talked about divisions within the communities, not just outside, but inside.
And that's what I'm getting at. So we have to ensure that within our community, within that all of our families, that all of our community organizations abide by the same principles, have similar ideologies, and are asking for similar outcomes from government.
And just to jump in on the constituency piece as well, because this is an interesting one for me. You might notice data at the international level in particular is a little bit loosey-goosey on things. So there's not really strong statistics that I have to back this one up. But estimates would suggest that if you take disability generally and then incorporate family into that, so mom, dad, siblings, grandparents, cousins, that thing, the number that they estimate is that approximately 25% of all households have a connection to disability. That is not a small interest group. That is a meaningful, substantive part of who we are, who our global communities, who our local community is. So I think sometimes we do think, oh, we're just this tiny little group over here and nobody's listening to us. And we got to stand up and say, that's not on. We are here. We are huge when we all come together.
But how do you confront, or how would you rebut or respond to the parent who says, if your kid is in my class, my kid isn't going to get the education she...
It's not pie.
I know. And I'm glad you raised that, but how do you get into the mindset of someone like that and say, it's not a zero-sum thing. You're not going to lose because somebody else gains.
And in fact, you're going to do better because inclusive education, when done properly. And I think this is where we really struggle with when we talk about inclusive education, and families who really struggle even themselves to say, inclusive education isn't working for my kids, so I went to a segregated school. We have to be looking at what inclusive education in practice actually looks like. And many places are struggling to do that well. We are not supporting EAs to be more effective in how they're supporting kiddos. If we have EAs at all in the classroom, we have teachers who are drowning and not sure what to do. We need to be able to model and show this is what inclusive education is, and these horror stories is non-inclusive education. That is shoving kids in classrooms and hoping for the best, and that very rarely works out. So I think that we really need to be looking at that broader view of things and getting at what is it that keeps parents up at night. Why are we divided? It's because people are terrified and we grasp at the straws that we are offered because we don't think there's going to be anything else.
But I wonder if the system is amenable to the kind of change that everybody on the panel is talking about. Or is there an administrative or institutional suggestion that, well, this is kind of exotic and it's kind of a fad and it's sure we'll try it and see how it works. In other words, the rights of the child become in some way experimental. And if it doesn't work, well, there's always a segregated school. I just wonder how you turn the institution around to accept what is their, not only their legal responsibility, but their moral responsibility.
Well, I think the institution has been turning around. I mean, I don't think things have been stagnant. I don't necessarily think things have been going in the wrong direction. They've been going in the right direction.
Yeah.
We're just not there yet, and we have to move a little bit faster. And so, if we think about if we think about different strategies, I mean, there is, speaking as a lawyer, like there is a litigation strategy. So we can go to the litigation route, and we can say, okay, well, we've got this robust legal system. Let's use it, and let's start challenging all of these discriminatory provisions and discriminatory pieces of legislation and see if we can come about change that way. Or we can focus on what we're doing here tonight and talk a little bit more about an advocacy-driven approach, a partnership between community organizations and family and government. We could think about, here in Canada, we don't have any kind of federal, provincial, territorial table that oversees disability policy, and I think that would be a great starting point.
Well, thank you. Let's put the audience to work now, and it's your turn. If you have any questions for the panel, we have people with microphones, and there's a question right down here. What?
They probably just shouted.
You could shout, but the mic is on its way. So.
So I'm Becky. I'm an EA, actually. I used to work for Community Living Toronto. And I guess, one of my questions is, I think I'm very lucky in the sense that I have worked with individuals and I have a background in ABA, so coming into the school system, I kind of have more knowledge, but I find that it is not mandatory or there's no, training for EAs and the individuals coming into the school system to work and have the honor to work with these kids and help them succeed. I feel like it's the institution, if there's a way to advocate for that to be, it should be mandatory so, we can help them succeed in whichever way that is, but I find, that is a big gap, that a bunch of EAs, I feel, are not equipped with the knowledge and resources to help individuals and their families succeed. So like, if I were to go about to like try and advocate, like I have mentioned it to like my certs and that kind of stuff, but like they can only do so much. Like where would I go, or how would I go about doing that, I guess.
What would make your job easy, right? It will never be easy,
It's
but
not
easier.
easier would be having more EAs. It's very, like, it is quite difficult. Like, I'm in a classroom myself with 4 individuals who all are very unique and all have different needs and different triggers and different education levels. So for me to run with 4 kids at different levels and different triggers is very difficult, because even though for one kid this might be working, it's not working for the other kid. And how can I do that? But I have no one to help me. I have no one else to do that. Or with like kindergarten, this girl who is on the spectrum and her family is here on a visa, so they don't have access to health care, so they can't get her a diagnosis. So she's going into grade 1 next year, and I know she's not going to get funding for an EA because they can't get a diagnosis and they can't get that, and that's difficult for me to watch. Like, I really wish I could help her next year, and technically I'm not even with her, I'm with another little boy. I just can handle them both together so it works out. So I don't know, I think, yeah, help, more resources for parents. Like, I find I work in like the ghetto of Oshawa, I guess, a very poor area in Oshawa, and a lot of our parents with individuals with disabilities don't know where they can get access to help. Like, even, I feel like, not a lecture necessarily, but even someone to come in and like talk to our parents and be like, yeah, like, you can get free resources here or there, like these people could lead you to the right path would be very helpful. But I find the lack of education there and the lack of money and all that kind of things like definitely contributes to their quality of life and their access. So, no, the proper training, I think, would be helpful for everyone.
How do you want to handle it? I mean, these are the frontline people, right? They're at the pointy end of the whole system. And when you hear that kind of concern, where do we look for the answers?
I mean, I think you provided them. It's in more resources, it's in more training, it's how do we support teacher training in general. I think we have to be careful that we don't get caught in this notion that we need specialized training so special people can work with special kids. Like, we tend to get caught that somehow there's this idea of, I'm going to do this if I work with kids on the spectrum, or I'm going to do this if I work with this type of disability and this. So we need to move away from this label understanding. Some of the things that we've seen, a huge issue is giving EAs more credibility and more support. We know you have knowledge and expertise, and often our systems tend to ignore that and not take that on board. So I think that there's a really big piece in recognizing that role, knowledge, and expertise. I think it's also in how do we support people to feel like it's okay to make mistakes and to be able to say, oh my God, I'm having a really hard day and this isn't working. What do I do? And who do I troubleshoot with? And we have found that when there is more opportunity for that troubleshooting and feeling like you're supported, it tends to make people feel less stressed, which tends to make them manage things. Again, for me, back to the notion of how are we changing the education system for everybody? We know those classrooms are not working for all of those kids that are in there. What are we doing around sensory issues in classrooms? What are we doing around recess, around lunches, around all of these pieces to make sure that all of those kids are having the optimal day that they can have?
Another question. Yes, right over here.
Hi, I have a question specifically for Jessica. I followed you online a lot, and I know that you have taken on a specific cause that you've been advocating for somebody's rights quite actively in the community, and I was wondering if you wanted to share something about that tonight.
Oh, yes I do, and I have it here. So, I'm a very lucky woman. I have a family and so many friends that love and support me. Not everyone with a disability has a family and friends to support them. I was also born with Down syndrome, but it has not stopped me from living a fabulous life. I take acting and dancing classes at a company called Drumaway. 2 years ago, at Drumaway, I was partnered with a young man for a play. I invited him to my house to practice. When he arrived, my mom and dad were very upset to see how worn out his clothes were. My dad gave him socks, shoes, and a coat to wear. We gave him food to take home. My parents were so worried about him. My mom and I went to visit him at his apartment. He had a broken bed with no bed sheets on it, and broken furniture, dirty clothes everywhere, and very little food. This was his life, and he didn't think it could be any other way. My mom called the 2 agencies that help him, and an extreme clean was done on his apartment. My dad, my mom, and my sister Bobby all helped. I wanted to help my friend, so on my Facebook page, I asked family and friends to donate money and items to him. Everyone was so generous. I collected $2,000 in cash and household items, gift cards, and baskets. With the money, we took him shopping for new clothes, things for his home, and food. St. Vincent de Paul gave him a new double bed, table, and chairs. He had a home he was so proud of. He was so happy and could not believe we wanted to help him. He didn't know how to keep his home clean, do laundry, or keep himself groomed, so we taught him. He has FAS, ADHD, and suffers from depression. He is one of my best friends, and I call him my brother. We both love music and movies, and love to laugh all the time. Our family will watch and help him forever. This is my message to you today. My friend has the right to have a better life like I do. My friend has the right to learn how to make his life better. He just needed the support of a family. A solution might be to help youth with special needs who don't have a family connect to a family who wants to change a life. A family can create miracles. Thank you.
Jessica, you should be moderating the panel, and I'll sit over there. Other questions? Am I missing someone? Oh, I'm sorry, right over here on the aisle.
I wonder if I'm allowed the luxury of asking 2 questions to different sectors of your panel. If I could ask Sam and Jessica to tell us a little bit about either the challenges or the success you had in getting ready to go to Humber. Okay, and if I may refer my second question to, I'll call my expert side of the panel, we haven't touched too much on funding. And I was wondering, I mean, that's a big issue for governments. They may accept general principles, and they may accept things that they are aiming for over the long term. But are you having discussions that effectively point them in the direction of how they achieve these lofty goals and how they fund them? Because that's going to be where the rubber gets very close to the road, because if you can't prioritize your funding, you can't have progress. But I'd like to hear from the young people first about their challenges or success.
Sam, thank you. Thanks very much. Sam, going to Humber, what is that like for you? How did you manage to get there?
So my main spec ed teacher named Miss Sala thought that Humber College would be a good route for me post-secondary. And so she told my parents about it, and they thought it would be a really good idea. So we went to a lot of the open houses and went to a lot of the gatherings there and all that kind of stuff. And at first I was like, I don't know, I don't know if I want to. I want to stay with my friend. But after a while, I really saw that this college would be a really good resource for me post-secondary, because it would give me A, more freedom, and B, more ways to socialize with people. And so I sent in my application, which was kind of a questionnaire type thing. And I went for the interview, and they said, you will get a call if you get in, or you will get a note if you do not get in. So on April 2nd, which is the day that they said that they would call if I got in. And they said, so I was just like waiting, just looking at my watch, being all like anxious and nervous and wondering, oh, am I gonna get in or not? So, and I got this call on my phone, and it's a number from Etobicoke. My mom's like, please answer that call, please answer that call. And so I did, and it was a person saying, congratulations, you've been accepted into the 2018 class of the CICE program. So I got really happy, I'm really excited, and almost cried because this, I never really thought I would ever make it to college, and I'm totally, like, this is gonna be a really good experience for me, and I'm totally proving all those people wrong who said that I wasn't gonna do it.
And Jessica, you're going to do the same thing, I take it?
Yeah.
Prove these people wrong.
Yeah, definitely. So as you can tell, I'm 20 years old now, and I still live with my mom and dad, and I really just want to get out of the house. Yeah, so I just want to get out of the house and have my freedom. Definitely. So that's one challenge about that. But the successes that I actually got into the program, the CICE program, but I deferred it for next year because I'm a really busy woman. And I want to stay at my high school for one more year as well.
Jessica, I wanted to get out when I was 18, so you're okay. The funding question. Does it all or any of it come down to money? I mean,
Yeah.
all of it?
Not all of it by any stretch, but funding is a big part of this. And I think a big question when we look at funding and talk about what we call CRPD compliant budgeting is a real question around where are we using the money that we have. And if we are continuing to double fund a segregated system and a regular system, we are never going to have enough money in the regular system to do it effectively. So we have to be looking at how are we better investing in regular and mainstream systems to make them more effective for everyone. I think we need to be breaking down the sort of silos of funding that we have. And I think we have to address no amount of funding is going to help fix crappy services sometimes. We need to be making sure that where we are investing our funding is giving people that inclusive experience, that we are helping people to live the lives of their choosing. I really appreciate Jessica and Sam's comments about more freedom, or Jessica talked about being a mentor. Where are we investing in the development of self-advocacy? Where are we investing in helping people be leaders within the disability community? And there's a funding piece that's tied into that, but it also for me reinforces that need for looking at how we're using the funding that we have and how can we be more effective in using what's there.
How do we, I was going to say pressure, but, well, I will say pressure. How do we pressure governments to do more? Brendon, do you have any thoughts on that?
With respect to funding
Yeah.
in particular?
Or the prioritizing, as the gentleman said.
Well, I mean, I would take it a step back, and again, I would apply a human rights lens here, and identify values, principles, and outcomes. Like, what do we want to achieve? And I don't know that we've got consensus with respect to identifying these outcomes. I don't know if that we have consensus even within our sector or within our community with respect to a common value base. So I think we have to start there. We have to identify what our value base is, where we want to go, and then figure out the funding piece. And if we start the conversation with funding,
The other end, yeah.
we're never going to achieve what we're striving for.
But it could be on parallel tracks, doing both at the same time, no?
Absolutely, but again, we have to have a common ask, right?
Yeah.
So if we've got fragmented groups or fragmented ideologies, we may be asking for different things even within our own community, which just confuses government.
And gives them the opportunity to do nothing.
Correct.
Yes, any more questions? Right here in the front row.
I just have a comment for, when we chose Jessica's high school and the options that we had. So on the options that we were given was, one school had where she would be going to 2 classrooms back and forth, and that was it. And then the other school, which she currently goes to, Hayden Park Secondary School, is a school that has everything. Her gym, her science room, her art room, the library. And so Jessica's truly getting a high school experience. And she's not just going back and forth to 2 schools and then being taken out for a couple classes. So it's very positive for her, and she's become a leader in this school. It's just incredible. She's ran for president twice. Never would she have given that opportunity at the other school, where the 2 classrooms. So I think it's also what is the schools offering these people with special needs, where they can actually grow into a productive, happy person.
That's why you want to stay another year or so at
Yeah.
high school.
Yeah, but Humber's going to be just
so
as
then
fabulous.
I can let's say, join in on the next year's prom, or running for prom queen, stuff like that. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
We
And
didn't think she'd get accepted to Humber the first time.
Yeah.
We were pleasantly surprised. We were really, just surprised. But again, she's such a busy lady this year that's why she's deferred it. But, which is great. It's because she's just grown into a wonderful woman with a lot of guidance.
I'm not surprised that she got accepted at all. Harvard next. Yes, over here on the aisle, and then inside that row.
Yeah. This question is for Sam and Jessica. I wanted to know if you think that kids with an intellectual disability are being respected.
You want to start, Sam?
I think it's sort of is kind of a yes or no situation. It's just that I think that certain attitudes about people with intellectual disabilities, they're starting to change, but I feel like we have a really long way to go, unfortunately, and I really think it should not be that long. But I just really hope that we can really get to that point soon, because treating everyone with respect, it makes the world so much better for us.
Jessica, do you want to jump in?
So, in my experience at my school, Hayden Park Secondary School, me and my peers are highly respected. But my friend, he wasn't being respected at all.
In the same row, I think. Yes, right there.
I have a question for Anna. So the
when you report, not you, but you, report about how the UN Convention is being addressed in Canada, inclusion looks very different across the country. Inclusion looks very different school to school. How do you provide an accurate picture of what inclusion or how the convention is being addressed in Canada when it is so broad and vast?
It's a great question and a huge challenge. So we rely obviously on our members in Canada to help us understand and shape that understanding that we have. When we look at a country, we look at country reports. So I'm not sure if anyone has been involved. Canada recently reported to the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. They are required to have a federated breakdown in their reports, so the provinces have sections in those. To be honest, those reports tend to be a lovely long list of all the great things that the provinces are doing about disability in different areas, which is why our voice is even more important, to be able to come to the committee and say, yeah, but here's what's actually going on. And so it is different. It's different where everyone is. For Inclusion International, a really big piece that we believe in is wherever people are on the journey, if the direction is inclusion, we're on your team. We're here to help you out. How can we do technical support around policy development? How can we link you to someone in another country or someone in another part of this country that might have some of the expertise? One of the things that we value from our network is that there is not a single problem anywhere in the world that somebody else hasn't already dealt with. So how do we bring those pieces together so that we can help that development to inclusion become a little bit more even? I do believe that there could be potential charter challenges around the disproportionate availability of services across the country, given that there is a federal responsibility and that we do have a charter that has that sort of federal statutes ingraining disability in there as under protected ground. So there is a lot to be done, and we have to onboard that in our analysis.
Sorry, and is there a timeline of when the convention needs to be implemented? Like, is there a dream goal? Or is it just kind of to be ongoing forever?
Well, I mean, it's an ongoing thing, but an interesting link around that is the 2030 agenda. So there's the Sustainable Development Goals is now the largest development agenda that the UN has tackled, and it replaces the Millennium Development Goals, and it has a time-bound stamp of 2030. And we've worked really hard to make sure that the 2030 agenda takes into consideration the rights of persons with disabilities. So SDG 4 is on inclusive education. Like, it is actually titled inclusive education. So by 2030, we've got some pretty strong benchmarks about where we should be on that around the world. SDG 11 is on inclusive cities. For us, we've taken a very strong stance that means cities where people live, where they want to live, who they want to live with. That means closing institutions, it means closing the sort of warehousing and segregating of people. So we can use other opportunities that do have time stamps on them to try and create those sort of goalposts for us to make real change.
I just want to mention to Brendon, you talked about a charter challenge of some kind. People know Cindy Blackstock, I think, who's worked for decades for Indigenous children. She won a terrific battle at the Canadian Human Rights Commission in order to get equal funding for Indigenous kids as white kids do. So maybe that could be.
Yeah, and she's also done some amazing work. I don't know if she spoke about Jordan's principle,
Yes,
but they had really
she was at the
onboarded-
UN.
Yeah, they've done incredible work to be inclusive on that.
She's amazing. Yes, at the back there's a microphone, and then. Oh, sorry. Okay, you first.
I think when you look at inclusivity within high schools, for example, it's a huge challenge to look at language and actual acceptance before you want to go and say, okay, we need to make all these high schools totally inclusive. So for example, if my sister would have attended my high school, she would have been ridiculed and probably thrown slurs at daily. It was a very segregated community, even within our own deaf and hard of hearing department. People were awful towards those kids. And so I think before you address that issue of segregated classrooms, you should keep these children in places that they are thriving. They're thriving at that school. They would not be thriving if they were placed in a normal public school where they are faced with ridicule right now. And as our society has been built, there is no change regarding the use of words that are just unacceptable, or the use of the teaching. Some kids have a hard time keeping up it's the rate at public schools that they teach things, it's just, everything is already so segregated that to try and tackle that issue without addressing some societal norms first is almost impossible. So obviously with inclusive education being the ultimate goal, and you wanting to have it that people with disabilities can be in regular classrooms, but even while being in those regular classrooms still getting obviously help, because when Jessica and I learn the way both of us learn, there are obvious differences. She may take longer to understand certain things, I may go a lot faster, and so we would have to address the systems to be able to include all of that. So if you really want that integration, you have to make sure that it's not going too fast and there are those supports in place. But if you really do want that to happen, you've got to address the huge overarching theme that is often present in schools of kind of ableism. It's awful.
Also known as bullying.
Yeah. But so I know a lot through my high school years, there were many comments people made. I have tried many times for movements to have a World Down Syndrome Day assembly when people make comments on social media saying, "Man said when the Down syndrome hits." And so I commented back and I got quite upset. But that's a common occurrence in a public high school. And so to place everyone just there with no kind of preparation, I think is doing these kids a disservice, because you can't just put them there and have them, okay, bye, go be bullied. Like it's
Can I jump in on that? So I think we have to be careful not to be defeatist on things either, right? And I think it's important that we recognize that change is happening. We've got spread the word to end the word. We have seen a lot of change and a lot more recognition on the need to have valuing and appropriate language. We have schools who are tackling the issue of bullying, because schools, when that's happening in schools, it's often happening to a lot of people, and we have to be really clear that we can't wait till things are perfect and then say, oh, okay, now we're going to let people with intellectual disabilities come in on this. We have to be doing both things at the same time, and I think that we often think that we're going to do this school readiness, or we're going to do whatever it is, and that's all we end up doing. We never end up making that shift. And I think that there are some real challenges that people are having around bullying, around violence and abuse, and where is this school on those things? We need people who are monitoring that. We need champions. There's a mom out in BC who, I'm trying to remember how old Dallin was. He was in high school, was having a very difficult time, and she spent a summer and she hired the most popular kid in school and said, here's the deal, sweets. I'm going to pay you to make friends for my kid. And it's a complicated formula, and I'm not suggesting that it is the solution around anything. But what ended up happening was they built a true and nurturing friendship and relationship that blossomed into this entire change in the school. And so Dallin's mom literally had kids at school sending her text messages, because we all know kids are texting at school, being like, oh my God, this kid just said this, and she could then follow up with school. All right, what's going on? How are we getting on top of this? So we need champions like you in those schools who are going to stand up and say to your friends or say to whoever is saying these comments, not on. That's not okay on my watch, and I'm not going to stand here and let that happen. So I think we have to be really careful that we're not suggesting that inclusion is in this far-off neverland of when things get perfect, but also today, here, right now, make sure that we are supporting students who are supportive to take a stand and say this isn't okay and we have to do things differently.
We can take a couple more questions. There's someone in the back there. Yes.
Hi, I just have a quick question for Sam and Jessica. I'm just wondering if there are other rights that you think are that should be addressed in Ontario.
Other rights. What do you think?
Yeah, what do you mean by other rights, maybe? Would that help, Jessica?
Yeah, thanks.
Or what rights are important to you? So, for instance, Sam, I know the right to work is probably really important to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there any other ones?
I think I think the right to have a life after high school is definitely a right that I hold near and dear, and I really get kind of sad when I see the statistics of people with intellectual disabilities in the employment area, because I work at Starbucks currently and I work at Community Living Toronto, and I want to see more people like me have jobs and not have employers be like, oh, we can't hire them because they're intellectually disabled, or we can't hire them because they're autistic. Like, that to me is a ridiculous notion, and we need to get rid of that notion, and I think there needs to be better care for people like me post-secondary, so that's something I really hold dear.
Bro, Jessica?
So then there's also the right to go to school, right? And there's a right to have your own freedom.
And let's not forget the right to leave home, too.
Yeah.
Those two are tied together.
All right, question right here.
Hi, my question is for Anna and Brendon. You both mentioned that Canada has very strong legislation, and you mentioned that as a strength. But I would like to ask you if you have ever seen this as a barrier to the implementation of various UN conventions, particularly as Brendon mentioned, since there is not a federal, territorial, provincial table, and how do we ensure that these conventions don't stay on just a federal level as a promise or something that was signed on the first day of opening a convention, but it is then translated to provincial level, and the accountability is taken over on provincial and local level, particularly, for example, education, how to ensure that it goes to the provinces and then it goes to the school boards.
My favorite subject, federal-provincial relations. Brendon?
Brendon, I think that's always the challenge with international conventions. I think, Anna, you sort of started off your talk by identifying the fact that you're an optimist, a glass half full type of person when it comes to international conventions, and I think that we all should be. I think the reality is that it's often very difficult to operationalize many of the provisions in international law, international conventions. I don't know that I have an answer, or a very intelligent answer at least, to how we stay on top of both the federal government and provincial and territorial governments to ensure compliance, other than, again, thinking through these two frameworks, one being perhaps considering a litigation strategy, and the other really speaking to this advocacy-driven framework and partnerships between community organizations such as DCI and Community Living Toronto, making sure that we have buy-in from people in the community, from families in the community, making sure, again, and I keep on coming back to this, that there's a common value base and that we all have a common vision. And I don't know if you've got any other thoughts. Yeah.
I agree.
Two quick questions, please, because we're running a bit late. Right here in the third row. And then up here.
Thank you. It's not a question. You're off the hook. I'd just like to make a statement, and I'm speaking as a mother of a 35-year-old daughter named Rebecca, who is an incredible young lady. She has complex care needs, and she's an individual that most would think could not be in the school system, period. And Rebecca had a fully inclusive education in her local elementary school and high school. She had great teachers. She had all kinds of supportive people who could imagine a better world than the one that many imagine. And in fact, it was her classmates that really made it all happen, and the teacher facilitated it. But everyone in that school benefited from Rebecca being in it. And I remember a social worker coming to visit when they were all in grade 8, and saw the grade 8 boys who are normally trying to be really cool in other schools. In this school, they were skipping because they knew Rebecca liked skipping. And Rebecca uses a wheelchair, and they would flip the thing back and forth. And she said, I can't believe these guys. These are going to be the greatest fathers, lawyers, doctors, you know. And then in high school, she went to a school called Mary Ward, and it's a self-directed learning school, which I think all schools should be, because it doesn't matter what stage anybody is at. It works for them. And again, the teachers could engage the other students in helping create the curriculum for Rebecca, and she was going on blind dates and things like that. So what I would love to see, and I so appreciate the stories tonight, because I think stories are probably the most important thing in shifting people's perceptions. First of all, I think we need to imagine a better world where people don't feel bullied. And I honestly believe people like Rebecca are leading the way in helping people see a better world. But we have to find ways of getting those stories out, because, as I say, we have a wealth of stories with Rebecca and other people who can show how this can be done well. But if you're not hearing them, you don't imagine that it's possible. So I just say thank you for the stories, and that I think is a big piece, is helping us imagine a better world.
Thank you for yours. Last word, right here.
I just wanted to, as a statement, I work at KELC with the TDSB, and I teach PSW, adult PSW future students, and one of the areas I do teach is intellectual and physical disabilities. And I have like 41 students right now willing and able to get out into the workforce. And I am trying to develop sensitivity and encouragement to work with a variety of people. One of the things is I'm wondering, I know funding is always an issue, but there's a lot of people there that are willing to help. And we don't look at disability as much as ability in my class. Like I take the disability out and I just add ability. And I'm just wondering how we could do that connection. Like how do I, like there are people out there who could use your help as a PSW. It's, I don't want to walk on EA's toes, but we're there. 41 students I've got to get out there. And how do we connect it? Anybody?
That's a tough one.
Leave your phone number with me.
I mean, I've worked with all kinds of disabilities throughout all my career. Visually impaired, deaf. One of my best examples of this was amazing in school. I had a child who had CP. And we had to get her, we took a school trip and I put her off bus, on bus, and I was lugging her on and then her wheelchair on, and and eventually we stopped at a hotel and there was pinball machines. And one thing she was very good at was pinball. She could do pinball like none of the boys could do. And so all the boys were surrounding her going, show us how you do that. And she was amazing. And I could tell you, all the kids helped me off and on the bus from that point on. But I guess the point too is like there's a lot of examples of great stories, but how do we get the helpers out there? How do we get the funding for them to be out there?
Well, I think it's a challenge for us in the media to do it.
I'll be over at CBC tomorrow.
All right. I want to thank the panel, and I'm sure you do too. They're wonderful. The gentleman rushing up to the stage is Brad Saunders. He's the CEO of Community Living Toronto and has a few concluding words. Brad?
As I was walking over here this evening from the subway, it occurred to me that this really felt like the first patio evening of the summer. We really appreciate you not going to a patio or your patio, but joining us tonight inside to discuss this important and thought-provoking issue and lecture. So from us on the stage and who organized, thank you to the audience so much for attending. So over the last little bit at Community Living Toronto, we've rebranded ourselves with mission and vision and values. Anyone who's been through this knows it can be quite tedious. But one of the issues that kept rising up was advocating for people's rights as a core piece of the work that we do every day. And our new mission and vision, and even our logo has changed to reflect our stand on supporting rights and choices while envisioning a society where everyone belongs and feels valued. And Anna, when you mentioned that tonight, I felt, whew, I think we got something right. That's good. Your words, Anna, really resonated with me tonight. Your thought of if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. I think we need to get off the menu and back and at the table. And I'm glad that you believe in conventions and the power of them, because it sometimes feels so far away. But to have it made relevant really stood out. Really glad you're in our corner and that this work is really part of your DNA. Thank you. Michael, usually I listen to you on earbuds on the subway, so they see you in person is fantastic. Thank you for you're so generous with your time and facilitated this beautifully. Thank you very much. And the job was made so easy by our panel up here. Sam, Jessica, Brendon, and Anna, thank you so much for your time and putting yourselves out here. We have a small token of our appreciation that will be handed out to you right now, so please take a moment to enjoy. We've got swag, yes. This is the big leagues. I should also say that at Community Living Toronto, we've not done this type of thing before, and it's been a real pleasure to work with DCI to pull this off. A ton of work goes into this, and I thank Angela and her team for doing that, and DCI and your board as well, so thank you very much. Very, very good evening. And finally, please join us. We've got a bit of refreshment down the hall. There's a bit of a maze, but we'll all get there if we stick together and not get lost. And thank you please come in and enjoy a beverage, and we'll continue the conversation in a little more informal atmosphere. Thank you very much for coming.